Good morning and welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Now, it is indeed a wonderful privilege to be with you one more time. Now, in today's discussion, we're going to talk about Jamaica, right? And the question can be, you know, asked, is Jamaica an independent country? Now, that is a very controversial and sometimes contentious a question, right, in among lots of Jamaicans, because we tend to be so tied, as is normal, right? Because people like to be patriotic. They have this, obsession with the countries from which they originated, the countries in which they were born. So it is normal that you want to think that you are not enslaved, rather, as it were, to another society. Particularly as a people, we came out of slavery, right? Most Jamaicans came out of slavery. It was first colonized, the island was first colonized by the Spanish, and then we had the British who came and colonized, enslaved the country in 1655. Very important that we understand that. Now, so when we thought we came out of slavery in 1834, with the ending of the slave trade there, you know, it is natural that people, particularly of African descent, would not want to be associated with slavery or even the mere thought of being enslaved to another country. But one of the primary, I should say, attributes of a free nation is economic independence, right? Because if you're not independent economically, it means that you have to be tethered, um, you have to do the biddings of the nation who has that economic power over you, right? For example, the child living with his or her parent, right, or parents, they are not economic, they don't have economic independence, right? And for that reason, the mother and the father set the rules, right? And the child has to listen, even if the child is, you know, big enough, has become a young adult and stuff like that, still has to follow the parents' rules because the parents pay the bills, right? And sometimes give them pocket money, etc., 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 right? So whatever the parents say, right? Under normal circumstances, that I'm not talking about families in which, there is no order. I'm talking about homes in which there is a structure and there is order, right? And under normal circumstances, the child will have to listen to the dictats of the father and the mother, right? Likewise, a nation that is not economically dependent is going to be in that situation, metaphorically, of a child, right? Because that nation has not yet grown up fully if it is not economically independent. And for that reason, parents often encourage their children to get an education or a skill so that they can become economically independent. Because if they're not economically independent, they can be big adults. And if you're not economically independent, you're still acting as a child because you have to depend on someone else. And nobody likes to depend on someone else because in that way you lose your freedom, right? You're not as independent as you think you are, right? Because you know, imagine sitting and waiting to be fed, right? And to be clothed and to be housed by someone else. Something that nobody, well, most people do not desire. Now, on that note, in 2012, Jamaica celebrated its 50 years rather, of independence from Great Britain. And it was a big deal for not only Jamaica, but Trinidad also, because remember now that we got our independence in was it July 6th? August 6th, I beg your pardon, August 6th, 1962. That's August 6th, 1962. And Trinidad got there sometime, I think it was August 31st, The Trinidadians can correct me if I'm not correct. August 31st, 1962. So it was just, hardly a month after Jamaica's independence that Trinidad likewise decided to walk on that same path, right? The path of independence. Now, Jamaica celebrated along with, I think it was through the Arthur Salisis School at the University of the West Indies, on a campus in Kingston, and also at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. They were celebrating this, these 50 years, or those 50 years, because they've now passed, those 50 years of independence. So, I was in Jamaica at the time of that celebration, right? And I wanted to see what was happening and what they were talking about, right? And they held the conferences. Most of the conferences were held at the Pegasus Hotel in Kingston. So I decided to go to some of these conferences. I couldn't attend all of them, but I went to the ones that were talking about the economy, and also political independence, and also history, because those are my areas. I love to read around those topics and to talk about those topics and so forth and so on. So I went to some of the conferences, and I was not impressed, to say the least. Right? I thought that most of our intellectuals coming mostly from the University of the West Indies. You also had Jamaicans from the diaspora who came from different universities who spoke also, right? But for the most part, the ones that I attended were scholars, were academics from the University of the West Indies on campus. And the impression I had of those discussions, of those intellectual conversations, were conversations rooted in book learning and not in the realities that afflict Jamaica, right? And I think Martin Henry, that is the former Gleaner columnist who passed away, unfortunately, in 2019, of all the journalists that I've read in Jamaica, he is the only one in quite a number of his articles who have been saying to our scholars, to our academics, to just lift their heads out of the books, out of these theoretical books, and confront the realities. Those are my words, right? But he often says that because oftentimes our academics are not known in Jamaica to meld, they're not able to merge, as it were, their scholarship with the real realities of the country, right? Somehow the university has not yet learned to do that, right? It's just about going to conferences, and saying that you are a theorist and you're you're an excellent guy on Marx, or you're an excellent guy on, Eric Williams, and his theory inside out, and you can explain it, right? And you try to see if some of the things that he has said can be applied to realities, but you really don't know, right? And you probably don't want to know, because the most important thing is to be able to flaunt your knowledge, right, of Eric Williams or Karl Marx, right? And that is not what education is about, right? It is about the critical analysis of the problems that afflict society, right? From the days of Teachers College, I learned that, right? That the purpose of education is to be able to solve the problems of our society. And if we look around us, whether it's in North America or it is in, Europe, or it's in Africa, and to some extent in Asia, we can say that our education system has really not solved a lot of the problems of our world. We like to say that, so much to the contrary. We like to say that, oh, we have uplifted these X number of people out of poverty. But, to what extent have we done that? Now, having said that, I met at the conference Norman Girvan. I've always heard about him. He's a Jamaican intellectual, or was a Jamaican intellectual. He's now deceased. He was deceased in 2014. Now, Norman Girvan was a regionalist. He believed in Caribbean integration. He believed that as a region, I think he perhaps wanted the entire region, including the Spanish-speaking and the English-speaking countries of the region, the Francophone-speaking also countries of the Caribbean, like Haiti, to come together as a region and declare that we are one, because we're tiny islands, right? And that is what I think in that vein, and that we share a history of slavery and colonialism, right? So that is understood. I don't share that philosophy. I don't think that we can be integrated. I think we can cooperate with each other in terms of, especially if we're near each other. For example, Haiti, the Dominican Republic are very close to Jamaica. So it would be sensible, it would be wise, it would be prudent to be able to, to have some sort of commercial interaction, right? And we used to also do exchange of students, right? Where they could learn English and, and they could learn Spanish or French or Creole, whatever the student is interested in learning. But I don't think that culturally we are all the same. We have the history of slavery, yes, but we are separate nations and we culturally we're different. It's just like the Americans and the Canadians, right? Practically they're the same people historically, right? They're the same people, but they believe in different things. Culturally, they're different, right? One is more revolutionary. Americans have a more revolutionary mindset. The Canadians tend to settle for the status quo, right? So that is the history, and for that reason they had to separate. So I think that the Jamaican mentality is totally different from the Trinidadian and vice versa, right? The Haitian mentality is totally different from the Jamaican mentality because of culture, the cultural norms and habits, right, etc., etc., etc. So we would never be able to merge, to integrate. And some of these nations are far away. For example, Trinidad and Tobago, way, in the south, right? The southern cone of the hemisphere. There's too far from Jamaica to be, to be having that interaction. And that is why even the CSME, that's what they call it, and CARICOM really is just a show, right? It's not working, right? I think we're spending a lot of money on these integration policies and, and they're not working because we just have differences and we have not been able to get over our differences. And you cannot force people to love someone or to be on good terms with them. You can educate them. And that I think we could do. Another thing we can do is to try to educate our people about different countries in the region. I think that is lacking, and we need some sort of enlightenment where that is concerned. Because I think most of my education about the Caribbean really, was learned away from the Caribbean, outside of the Caribbean, right? So I think we need to do more, more studies, and we need to, include in our curriculum aspects of Caribbean studies, right? That students who are leaving high school, primary school, from elementary to high school, they should be indoctrinated, as it were, right? With some Caribbean historical and cultural facts and awareness, right? Those are very important if we really want, if we are really desire to become a unified Caribbean region. But so much to say, when I saw Professor Norman Girvan, I said, oh, it's just one of those UWI lecturers who are going to just speak a lot of, theoretical, you know, knowledge, right? Nothing to understand, nothing to examine, nothing to assess Jamaica's realities, right? And Jamaica has some very harsh socio-economic realities, very harsh, right? And when he's, just from the topic of his lecture, the topic in my words were, that we are still, Jamaica is still independence, right? So he was saying that we're not independent. and mean that we can do things. We're a sovereign nation as we think we are. We are independence, right? Which means that we depend on others outside, right, to help us. I remember, and he was making that speech when we were having problems with the IMF because of what had happened with the whole Tivoli Gardens, West Kingston incursion, right, in 2010. And even before that incursion by the United States of America, we were having problems with the IMF and, you know, inking out an agreement because the then Prime Minister Bruce Golding and his finance minister Arthur Shaw, you know, they could not ink out an agreement because they understood the implications and they understood that had they gone the IMF way, that it would have led to a lot of protests on the island because they, you know, were demanding, as the IMF likes to do, right? They were imposing harsh economic conditionalities on the island. And Bruce Golding, give him his credit, and Arthur Shaw, they both knew that those sort of, you know, policies would have negative consequences on the island, and they did not really sign up to that. And it seems like after one thing to the next, it went into a Tivoli Gardens incursion by the United States, the killing of, you know, a number of our citizens, innocent lives, right? Which Washington doesn't care about, really. And so after that, we were sort of there as a country because the IMF seemed to have told, and the World Bank, the rest of the international community, that's the monetary international community, that they should not lend Jamaica any money. Can you imagine a country living and all of the markets, the financial markets, are closed to her? And that's what happened. And there was some rumors, I think it was true, because I think I might have read it somewhere, in which there was somebody in Congress, in the US Congress, who said that they should let Jamaica burn, right? Because we were too, I guess, we didn't want to listen to the IMF, we didn't want to listen to the people from the World Bank, right? Eventually, we signed up to a loan in 2013, I believe, and we've moved on from then. However, the loan that we signed off to, you know, with the IMF is a loan that was so austere, right? One of the most, if not the most austere, right, economic agreement between any country and the IMF in the history of the IMF. In the history of the IMF. And our intellectuals, or so-called intellectuals, I like to call them pseudo-intellectuals, right? Nothing came from them, right? Not even a word came from them. All of them united by saying, yes, we have to pay down our debt and we have to watch our macroeconomic fundamentals, and that the IMF had changed, right? That was the primary reason for entering to that austere agreement, right? While other people on the other side, who critics of the IMF, you know, were saying that Jamaica's agreement was horrible, was something that was going to be untenable, right? It was not going to result in the economic success, right, of the country. But our intellectuals in Jamaica, they just like to go with the status quo, and they went. And we are witnessing, even today, the fact that our roads cannot be fixed, our hospitals are in deplorable conditions, our education system is rotten to the core, right? Resources cannot be dispersed because we have no money, right? Because we are paying down on this debt, and our debt to GDP ratio has to go down to, I don't know what, right? And Jamaica, for the most part, has been responsible in paying its debt. So for the IMF to have been so stringent and so austere is ridiculous, right? But that is what they do when you are not independent. When you are independence, right? people can do anything that they want with you. And Jamaica is a special case in the Caribbean. And I think it is time for its people, right, to assess fully what is happening on that island nation. I think that there are no critical discourses on the island. I think, when you speak to people, they just utter what they hear from the media, right? So even talking to friends and families, right? You'll hear things like, oh yeah, it takes time, right? It takes time for economic progress. Jamaica is 60 years old. 61, I think now, right? Is it 61 now? Yes, it's 61. Jamaica is 61 years old, right? And don't tell me at 61, you don't have a lot of the basics, right? Your hospitals are still in deplorable conditions, worsening as far as I am concerned, right? It is worsening, right? Dilapidated infrastructure, decrepit infrastructure, right? And people tend to be comfortable in saying, in the Jamaican lingo, better must come. They mean that tomorrow life will improve in some degree, right? But we've been hearing that since the 1960s, 70s, and better has not come. We have not seen any major improvements in the lives of all people. So when Norman Girvan stood up to speak, he commanded my attention, and I was not in any way disappointed with his analysis of what was happening there. And he was the only professor, right? And mind you, Girvan rather spent most of his years in Trinidad at the University of St. Augustine. So I don't know the fact that he wasn't living in Jamaica, if it had something to do with that he saw the problems much more, should I say now, he viewed them from outside within, right? And he was able to make a more balanced analysis. He didn't have to live with Jamaicans who perhaps would criticize him for his harsh, right, and frank and candid analysis, because we don't like to hear the truth as a people, right? We like to hear that we are a great nation and that everybody loves us and that we are just the best in the world. And guess who's the standard? Our standard are the athletes and the food that we have in the world, the patties and the jerk chicken and what's the oxtail, right? And we talk about the Usain Bolt and Bob Marley's, the musicians, right? And that to us is success. Now, I've never heard, and perhaps you can correct me, of a nation that was developed on these cultural, artifacts or symbols, just by singing, right, and dancing, and having a few well-known sports athletes, and by its food. Which country has ever been developed by that, right? We need to have higher standards. Now, that emphasis is, brought to the fore because the elites, the Jamaican elites, the political elites, and also the financial elites prefer to have the people reflect on those successes, because they know that if the economic situation comes to the fore and there is a critical discussion on those economic failures, that they would be questioned. And I don't think they would like us to know the truth about them, right? And the fact that they are working with international elites, with global elites, right, to stifle rather the Jamaica's socio-economic growth and development, right? Now, if we do not talk about these things, how do we think the country is going to move on, right? Can't move on. So today I'm going to assess And those of you who would like to stay, a speech, but I think I have to do it in two parts because it's quite a long speech. So I'll do it in two parts that was given by Professor Norman Girvan. And you can also go online and I will also attach a biographical description in the box after the video is finished. But let's analyze here some of what Girvan, right? Former professor at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, is saying about Jamaica. So he's saying, assessing, I think he was here at the Westminster in the Caribbean. He was at a conference and he was delivering the speech. Assessing Westminster then and now, Norman Girvan. Let me see if I can have this down here. Maybe such blocks my view. Okay, all right. So we have here Professor Norman Girvan. Let me put that there. At the time that Jamaica became an independent nation on August 6, 1962, I had just turned 21, coming of age at the same time as Jamaica's assumption of nationhood. So he's using the word assumption, right? Interesting word. I was left with little choice. My life vocation would be the national project. For those of my cohort of the University of West Indian University, national meant regional. West Indies was and is our nation. So for people like him and the Orlando Pattersons, right? This was what they thought, that, having gained independence, Trinidad and Jamaica, that we would eventually become a West Indian region. We were West Indians, right? And they used to pride themselves in calling themselves, even today, the West Indian intellectuals, right? Like to hear that. Now, we were not enamored of the so-called Westminster model, which is the British model, for those of you who don't know. Our circle of students and young faculty, drawn mainly from the social sciences and history, called itself the Society for the Study of Social Issues. We wrote papers that critiqued colonial economy, society, and polity. We proposed the corresponding anti-colonial models. I'm sorry, the font or the thing is pale, the lettering is pale. So please bear with me. The politics of colonialism was a politics of exclusion, right? So that was what the colonial masters did. They did not include the population in their developmental goals, right? It was just that you were there, right? You were not a participant in the economic and social development of the country. The politics of independence would be the politics of participation, right? That was Walter Rodney was the author of this paper. So that was what Walter Rodney, right, who wrote the Underdevelopment of Africa. What was the name of the book again? That Rodney wrote, Walter Rodney wrote. The Underdevelopment of Africa. Somebody remind me about that. But he was a very, very premier also, an outstanding, prominent West Indian intellectual from Guyana. The population would be mobilized for the tasks of nation building and the creation of a just society. This had nothing to do with the Westminster model. So he's here now, and he is casting aspersion on the Westminster model, which came from Britain, right? Which Jamaica still has, right? And rules under. So it means, therefore, that even in this first paragraph, Girvan is implying that Jamaica, because it still has that West Indian, that Westminster model, operates under that structure, under that system, that its democracy is not inclusive, right? It's not a participatory democracy. Citizens are not included, do not participate in government decisions and actions. All right, so all right, let's move on. In my reading, Westminster was an element in a package, the Independence Pact in the British Caribbean. That pact was not about independence. It was about preservation of the status quo. Okay. Its essential features, referring to the Jamaican case, which was true with minor variations for most of the territories were. First, the entrenchment of property rights in the Constitution. Second, entrenchment of the two-party system. And third, preservation of the laws, institutions, and symbols of the colonial state. And fourth, alliance with the Western powers in the Cold War. I will illustrate this by sharing some personal recollections and observations. Now, remember now that Jamaica became independent during the Cold War. Great Britain had now lost its power. It had lost its empire, right? So it was no longer an imperial power around the world. It had now given that baton to the United States. And we must understand, as I always say to my friends and also people who like to listen to stimulating and intellectual conversations, that the United States, right, being now the new empire after World War II, right, they had long in the 19th century claimed this hemisphere to be theirs through the Manifest Destiny document, right? So the United States, we understand that Jamaica is not far from the United States, right? Only what, probably 90 miles away from Florida, right? So the United States was not going to allow Jamaica to run its show, right? It was definitely and still does ensure that Jamaica does everything in its own geopolitical agenda, right? That's the US's geopolitical agenda, not to suit Jamaica's geopolitical agenda, but the United States geopolitical agenda. And if you understand the role of empires, then you would understand why. But I'm not going to go into that. I think you have to go back and listen to my video. Is the United States a democracy or is it a global empire? If you listen to that video that I made before, you will learn much from that. Now, in early 1962, several of us attended the sessions held in Kingston to solicit the views of the public on the design of the Jamaican Independence Constitution. Our main concern at the time was the retention of the monarchy. So that was the first red flag. We argued that it was contrary to the psychological necessities of nation building that the Queen of England should be the head of state of independent Jamaica, right? At least that's what we thought. Looking back, I have to confess to a feeling of grudging admiration for this ingenious device. It had the effect of embedding the core symbol of colonial governance into the institutions and rituals of the independent state. It connoted continuity rather than rupture, and I would argue that it institutionalized a fractured psyche of political allegiance among those who were to be responsible for running the affairs of the state. So, first of all, we still had the Queen. And do you know that there are many Jamaicans, and I must say that I'm one, who it took years to still know that, to really confront the fact that the Queen, or now the now king, is the head of state, right? In a country that we say that, is independent. Now, that was something quite interesting, right? What does it do? He's asking the question, what does it do to the state of mind of the Governor General, Prime Minister, ministers of government, parliamentary secretaries, members of parliament, and of the judiciary when, as a condition of assuming and holding office, which is required to take an oath to be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors. Now, in my opinion, right, I think that the Queen being head of state, or the king now, it's just symbolic. It really doesn't really, but I understand what he's saying here, that psychologically, it should affect the fact that you say you're a prime minister, or you are the judge of the Supreme Court, or whatever you're doing, position you hold there, and the Queen is your head, and you have to pay obeisance to her every parliamentary session. It doesn't make any sense. This feature of the Constitution was the target of a scathing polemic by Orlando Patterson. At that time, this was the revolutionary Orlando Patterson. He's not the Harvard, he wasn't the Harvard professor then, right? Which he is now, and sort of tepid intellectual that he is right now. He's not the revolutionary, doesn't have that revolutionary spirit as he once had. He's an older guy now, so we have to, you know, be sympathetic with him, right? Who accused Jamaicans' political leaders of a cynical betrayal of the masses, declaring that they had been brainwashed in the rank urine of British culture. And this is by Dr. Orlando Patterson. It would be interesting to note that the Harvard professor right now would still be in agreement with this statement made probably in his years of youthful exuberance, right? I would like to know that. Now, regarding public consultation, my distinct recollection is that these sessions were attended by a mere handful of individuals and that no one believed that they were meant to be taken seriously. Wow. The template of the Constitution was, I presume, supplied by the Colonial Office, which is now the fact. This is factual information that the Jamaican people or the Jamaican politicians then, that's under Norman Manley and, Bustamante, they did not write the Constitution. The Constitution was given to them by the colonial masters and lords, right? So that was something that also was despicable, to say the least, right? There was a joke that they printed them all somewhere and just substituted the name of the newest country. And by the way, when I was in this when I was at the conference that Dr. Girvan at the time was, when he was making his presentation, the question was asked after his presentation: do Jamaican politicians read the conditionalities outlined in the IMF agreement, right? Or in most IMF agreements? And the answer was, most of the times, they don't, right? So they just sign off to documents and send them to Washington, right? And your future is signed off and they don't care, right? They just don't care. So when you're hearing about these economic fundamentals and these macro, economic fundamentals that will push Jamaica forward, right? A bunch of nonsense. It is not the reality. And it is time for the professors at the University of the West Indies, particularly the economic professors, to be able to critique. And I'm not saying that they should wage a war against the IMF and the World Bank and these elite financial institutions. What I'm saying is that they need to render a balanced perspective, which they have not done. Right? We need to move beyond this sort, of following the crowd, because that's what we do. The details were negotiated by a joint select committee of the House, representatives of Jamaica's two main political parties that had emerged from the labor and the nationalist movements of the 1930s. It is structured in such a way that the two are virtually guaranteed an indefinite duopoly of political power. Because remember now that both these people, Norman Manley and Bustamante, were cousins. Right? So they're family members and, they're going to maintain the status quo, right? So it's a duopoly, right? It's not really, there's no really difference between the JLP and the PNP. They might differ in ideology, right? But as we're learning today, if you have not yet learned, ideology is just they're just ideas, philosophies, right? Has nothing to do sometimes with even your belief system. Do you know there are people who think, they say that they are against colonialism and that they're against racism, and deep down they're not. but they tether themselves to that ideology and say, just to show, it's an act, right? And they read all the books about colonialism and they can, tell you about what happened and stuff like that, but they're not convicted. It's just like a Christian. Reading the Bible, pleasure to read the Bible, and they can quote and tell you all that's in the Bible, right? But are they convicted of what the Bible teaches? They might not be, right? So be careful. Now, I recall that the entrenchment of property rights was inserted at the insistence of one of the richest men in Jamaica, owner of the island's single daily newspaper, which was the Gleaner. I remember Sir Alexander Bustamante, the first prime minister, saying that when he saw the last British soldiers departing from Jamaica, tears almost came from my eyes. I recall that when he was asked what Jamaica's foreign policy would be, he declared simply, "We are with the West." Now, I don't have a problem with this to some extent because, really and truly, we were under British colonialism. And even when you have, you know, fractured relationships, there is some amount of sadness when people come out of your lives, right? Even when they were not the best, right? Let's face it, we're human beings, and sometimes we do have that, feeling of nostalgia, right? That nostalgic feeling, emotions, right? That we cannot deny. Now, and there was nothing wrong in saying that he's with the West. If he did not mean that he was going to listen to everything that the powers that they tell him to do and not to do things in the interest of Jamaica, because we are in the Western society, right? We need to understand that we are a Western nation, right? So we have to be with the West. What are we going to be with the East? I don't know. Now, I remember him saying that communism would come to Jamaica over my dead body. That's what Bustamante says. And that one of his first actions was to offer the United States a military base. And we said that the United States is a different military in that it does not have colonies as Great Britain has. What does it have? It has military bases, right? And when it has military base on your island or military bases, it controls that country. Just like when the Pope goes to a nation and he bends down and he kisses that soil, he also is a symbol that he controls that nation too. Right? And this is what we need to understand. So what that is saying is that the US is the de facto colonial master, even though we have the British queen or king as the head of state. And that doesn't mean anything to the US because the US knows that the British king or the British queen mean nothing to America. Right? It is a symbolic jest or gesture. Right? Bustamante's own relationship with the British legacy was a quaint mixture of the fulsome admiration and self-serving manipulation. In 1946, he had been freed on a charge of manslaughter, and on leaving the court, he shouted to an adoring crowd, "Long live British justice! Long live the British Empire! And long live me!" What sort of narcissism, right? Our leaders have suffer from high doses of narcissism. Let's say that. What naughty boy he is. Now, the implanting of colonial ways of thinking into native elites was one of the outstanding successes of British policy in the Caribbean. It was key to the entrenchment of Westminster government in the soon-to-be independent states. In an insightful essay on the myth of independence, and I think you should probably go and read that article for yourselves, right? Jamaican political scientist Louis Lindsay quoted from a speech delivered by then Premier Norman Manley 5 months before Jamaica's independence, right? So Mr. Manley declared that the British Constitution is the best in the world, right? Not the American Constitution, right? Which talks about equality and stuff like that, right? It's the British Constitution, right? Again, the nostalgia, the feeling of nostalgia, right? He doesn't want his masters to go. The only good system of government, and this was quoted here. Holding this belief, says Lindsay, Mr. Manley's expressed pleasure and satisfaction that Jamaican leaders had done nothing which would have jeopardized the country's chances to receive, use the institutions of Westminster government. So in other words, let's go with the status quo. And anything that is going to demolish, that is going to destroy, that is going to eradicate that status quo will not be permitted. Right? And you must have those black masses down there be enslaved. You can never have those revolutionary-minded, Marcus Garvey-minded people with the blood of Marcus Garvey running through their veins. You can never have them free. They're going to create too much war, and they're going to be too arrogant, right? So you can't allow them to be economically free. I make no apology for the fact that we did not attempt to embark upon any original or novel exercise in constitutional building. Let us not make the mistake of describing as colonial institutions which are part and parcel of the heritage of this country. If we have any confidence in our own individuality and our own personality, we would absorb these things and incorporate them into our own use as part of the heritage we're not ashamed of. I am not ashamed of any institution which exists in the country merely because it derives from England. And I quote, I think that was what Louis Lindsay made. Over in Trinidad and Tobago, Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams, right, the guy who wrote From Slavery to Capitalism, the fierce critic of colonialism, capitalism and slavery, right? That is Capitalism and Slavery, you know, very interesting book, was declaring if the parliamentary system is good enough for England, it's good enough for us. It's good enough for me. Give me that old English Constitution. Give me that old English Constitution because it's good enough for me. Absolutely. Consider the striking contrast between the sentiments of Caribbean leaders and those expressed by Patrice Lumumba at the ceremony marking the independence of the Congo just 2 years earlier. Speaking in the presence of King Belgium, Lumumba said, although this independence of the Congo is being proclaimed today by agreement with Belgium, an amicable country with which we are on equal terms, no Congolese will never forget that independence was won in struggle. A persevering and inspired struggle carried out from day to day, a struggle in which we were undaunted by privation or suffering and stinted neither strength nor love. It was filled with tears, fire, and blood. We are deeply proud of our struggle because it was just and noble and indispensable in putting an end to the humiliating bondage forced upon us. This was our lot for the 80 years of colonial rule, and our wounds are too fresh and much too painful to be forgotten. So here we're seeing the difference, you know, absolutely, but we must understand that this African nation fought for its independence. Jamaica didn't, right? We just simply was handed over, you know, that, yeah, here it's go and run your country, go and run the show. Britain knew that she had lost her empire and there was no need to have a colony anymore. So take it in, move on. I can't help you. So, you know, we've gotten our wealth from you already, so you need to run, well, at least take on the problem, the headaches. We don't want it. We just want to be at the top and we just preserve the status quo for us, all right? That we can still continue to rule, or the US, who is now your new leaders, will be able to control you as a bunch of slaves on the island. A few more comments on the Jamaican Constitution. Reading it today is a surreal experience. There is great difficulty in thinking of it as the constitution of an independent state. The document, it actually, I should say the document is actually, the document is actually a royal order in council It begins with the words "at the court in Buckingham Palace," and this is followed by 8 pages of medieval sounding language. You will not find anything in it remotely like a reference to the sovereignty of the people or even of Parliament. And mind you, this was 1960s, in the 1960s, right, when they were forging the new nation. So obviously the United States was up and running, right? And would have some things right in it, yeah, I'm sure, right? So our Parliament, even our Parliament is not sovereign. And and they like to go and they like to pontificate in Parliament and make you believe that things are what they say, or they are running the show. They are not running the show. In fact, in the original version, the Jamaican people are sorry, are not referred to as such anywhere. So, in the United States, people are referring to the people, the people, the people, we, the people, whatever. Jamaica is not referred there because we are a bunch of slaves. Nor is there any reference to social and economic rights of the kind enumerated in the United Nations 49 years later. The Constitution was amended by the incorporation of a Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom. All right, so here it is behind the Independence Pact. The Independence Pact was made between the British with the Americans. Now, I hope that you are understanding, because sometimes when I speak, wow, what is he coming up with? This is the conspiracy theory guy, he believes in conspiracies, right? Only because you fail to read. You've got to read, and it's no time to laugh right now, right? Those of you who want stories and you want, things to laugh about, this is nothing to laugh about. I'm just being ridiculous right here, to be frank with you, because this is serious stuff that you've got to understand. That we are not an independent nation, that we are not sovereign in the way you think we're sovereign. You're dancing and eating your oxtail and think everything is merry and well, and that Andrew Hollis is going to give you this prosperous economy. He cannot, because he doesn't have that power in the first place, right? Now, let me read it again so that you can digest it. The Independence Pact was made between the British with the Americans hovering watchfully in the background, and the Jamaican political class that had emerged out of the mass movements of the 1930s. The Jamaicans would exercise formal political authority. The economy would remain in the hands of foreign firms and the local oligarchy. So when they're making their political promises to you, and maybe I can even stop here, because you need to get your acts together, Jamaicans. You need to understand that the country is not independent. It is independence, as Norman Girvan postulated during those 50 years of independence at the Jamaica Pegasus Hotel in Kingston that I attended, and I was there, right? And I knew that this guy was serious. And I was just there, wow, the wow factor. And his speech can be found online if you want to read. I think I did in the article I wrote for the Jamaican Observer, which was sometime when Jamaica was celebrating 60 years of independence last year. I did make a few quotations from that speech given by Norman Girvan, right? My doctoral thesis showed that at the time of independence, American, British, and Canadian firms were entrenched in bauxite mining, sugar, banking, and finance, while local landowners and merchants controlled the best land, tourism, and import trading. A key element would be a security apparatus with close links to the imperialist system. The core of the newly established Jamaica Defense Force was the Colonial West India Regiment. The officers attended courses at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, ties with the U.S. were doubtless ties with the U.S. were doubtless established soon after independence. Recently declassified colonial administration records, migrated archives, shows that in the lead up to Jamaica's independence, the British authorities, through the local special branch for the Jamaican police, were engaged in surveillance of a variety of individuals and organizations thought to represent potential threats to the system. And this is why you know that people like Marcus Garvey could not have been prime minister. And when Michael Manley became prime minister in the 1970s, 1972, I think, correct, he could not continue with his social plans to have some form of socio-economic equality in Jamaica. He could not. They wouldn't allow him. The Americans and the local oligarchy would not allow him to do that. Right? Very interesting, right? Now, their targets included the Universal Negro Improvement Association. These are the persons who were targeted, or the groups that were targeted. The World Federation of Democratic Youth, Mr. Dudley Thompson, who had defended Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya and later became Jamaica's foreign minister, and Harold and Kathleen Drayton, school teachers from Guyana and Trinidad, respectively, whose son, Dr. Richard Drayton, is Rhodes Professor of Imperial History at London University. So all these intellectuals had to go, including Walter Rodney, right? We know that Walter Rodney had to go, right? Now, can you imagine when you send away these top intellectuals, right? And I'm not saying that these guys, everything they did, that I was going to be endorsing, right? But it's just the fact that if you're going to live in a democratic society, you've got to have opposition. And you have got to listen to the opposing side to see what they're saying and to see if we can come to an awareness of the truth and if solutions can also be forwarded, right? Can be postulated. These are some of the things that we need to think about, right? In addition, the special branch was vetting staff appointments at the University College of the West Indies. That's now the University of the West Indies. A practice that was apparently stopped only at the insistence of Principal Professor Arthur Lewis. They were especially concerned about the possible local repercussions of the Cuban Revolution. They were monitoring a proposed visit to Cuba by a group of students from the University College of the West Indies. I was myself a member of that group of students. Our visit to Cuba was blocked by the government. All right? These are several files on Cuban, there are several files, sorry, on Cuban activities in Jamaica, arrival of ships, planes from Cuba. It is a safe bet that all this stuff was shared with the Americans and that the collaboration between the Jamaican Special Branch and the imperialists continued seamlessly after independence. So this didn't just happen after the Cold War. It's still in place. It continues, right? And they share information, and anybody who wants to demolish the status quo, who want to disrupt the status quo, will be taken out, right? Either you have to go somewhere else or perhaps be killed in some cases. Now, Grand Imperial strategy. I believe that what I have said about the Jamaican Independence Pact is largely true for the entire British Caribbean. The proof of this is the lengths to which the British and the Americans went to ensure that Dr. Cheddi Jagan, an avowed Marxist, would not govern an independent British Guyana. Recently declassified records tell a sordid story. By the way, this speech was made in 2013. So it was given in 2013. So this is an intellectual giant, an intellectual stalwart in the Caribbean, Professor Norman Girvan. He's no ordinary intellectual, an extraordinary intellectual, right? And it was given when he was in his 70s. He died at 72. So if he died at 72 in 2014, that means he was 71. So he would have had enough time to reflect, right? And he's now reflecting just a year before his death he's now letting us know what the truth is all about. And I know that some of you still don't want to hear the truth. You like to live in your darkness. And that's what the Bible says, that what? Men prefer darkness over light. Right? We love darkness. We love to say things are better in Jamaica. How can it be better in Jamaica? How can things be better in Jamaica under these circumstances? Even in enlightened America, the Americans understand, at least some of them do, that things are decaying. Things have decayed significantly, right? And we live in a Jamaica where you hear, oh yeah, we are like, remember America in the 1770s, they took years to forge a nation. What nonsense. What nonsense, The fact of the matter is that our nation is so different from the realities that governed America in almost every aspect, right? In fact, the Constitution of the United States, as much as it has not been lived up to, but for the most part, you don't have the entrenched class structures, and class cleavages that you have in Jamaica, which is a direct legacy of British imperialism, right? But you don't want to think. You just want to watch a documentary. You just want to watch a movie, right? And to talk to a few friends and say, this is what you think, right? We've got to think. We've got to have deeper conversations. And this is a speech given clearly after having deep reflections about our society. Thankfully, Girvan was not living in Jamaica at the time. I don't know how many Jamaican friends he managed to have kept. I just don't know. Now, we know that this was a grand imperial strategy of the colonial powers in Africa and Asia. In the essay to which I earlier referred, Lewis Lindsay concluded that the formal granting of the right of self-determination to traditionally devalued peoples of the Afro-Asian and Caribbean world was accompanied by devaluation of the meaning of independence itself. So they didn't want us to be independent, right? The core of the myth of independence, he theorizes, right? So this is a myth of independence, centers on the substitution of procedural and legalistic criteria for functional and substantive ones. Now, half a century of Westminster, looking back over the past half century, now he's talking about what's going on in the Caribbean, we see both continuity and change. At one level, the colonials' strategy succeeded very well. The population has been diverted from any agenda of revolutionary transformation. Politics is a perpetual game of alternating ins and outs and winner take all, right? Which are the political elites and the financial elites. It is characterized mainly by mudslinging, sensationalism, and pursuit of trivia, right? And, I like what he said, the pursuit of trivia. So people call you and tell you about, oh, how many cars we have on the road and how many big houses are in Jamaica. How is, who owns these cars? Where are these cars coming from? And, is that sort of economic arrangement going to build Jamaica? All these big buildings we're seeing down there, who are behind these buildings? Is organized crime behind some of this wealth that you're seeing on the island? And are those sort of criminal deals linked to the high homicide rate on the island? These are some of the hard questions that we have to ask. And the media houses in Jamaica are not doing that job because they're paid not to do it. Right? They're paid not to have any form of investigative journalism. Now, every 5 years, a cornucopia of election campaign promises is routinely made. Few are kept, so we know that you have all of these promises and only a few of them are kept. And the promises that are even, kept, most of the times they're not up to standard, right? If truth be told. People participation is limited to cheering and at election rallies, and they dance and they sing, right? Yeah, PNP, yeah, burn them, yeah, and all of that nonsense, right? We need to get rid of those things. People participation is limited to cheering at election rallies and the 10-second act of voting every 5 years. That is what we call democracy today, right? We have one of the best democracies in the world. Government is reduced to prime ministerial dictatorship. Can you say that again, Norman Girvan? Government is reduced to prime ministerial dictatorship. Because I've always said that what we have in Jamaica is a mild form of dictatorship. So that's what we have there, right? Because the citizens have to go along with what the government says or face the consequences. And the only time that they listen to you or pretend to listen to you, as I've said before, is when electioneering is in the air. And they pretend and they make a few promises and they might attempt to show that they're fulfilling these promises, but they never, or only a few, as he suggests here, are kept. Now, let us return to Jamaica, to the Jamaican case. In the 1970s, the prime minister, or the government of Mr. Michael Mann, and I think I should stop here, right? I think I should look at the 70s for a moment, right? Because this is a very important document, right? And not only an important document, but a very important analysis of Jamaica's independent status in the world, right? Among the sovereign nations of the world. I do not think, I've never held, I think from 2004, thereabout, while having watched this documentary called Life and Death and having read voraciously around the IMF and the World Bank and what they do to other countries. I've been reading these things from 2004. From 2003, I probably should say. Yeah, 2000, thereabout, 2003, 2004. Right? I've immersed myself in the literature concerning these institutions and the American Empire. I think, well, I've been reading about the American Empire from I became a Seventh Adventist. I understood very well the religious, underpinnings of the United States Empire, and when I went to college at Howard University, I started to delve more into the historical underpinnings, the secular underpinnings, the political underpinnings, and the economic underpinnings of the United States Empire. Right? And I have decided to share these insights with you. The problem is that we're living in a society, in a world at large, in which people do not want to hear things that upset their perception of what reality is, right? They don't want to hear these things, right? Because it destroys your foundational understanding of what you thought your society was about, right? And Jamaica is about freedom. Jamaica is about democracy. Jamaica is about maintaining the status quo. Now, we must give commendation to people, including our leaders like Michael Manley, who challenged the system, right? Wasn't successful. And we must also commend our citizens, particularly those who are coming from the lower strata society, who have moved up on the socio-economic ladder and have done well for themselves, right? But we must understand that that is not the norm. Those are the exceptions. And we do have small pockets of excellence on the island, and we have done quite a bit on the world stage. Don't get me wrong, we have produced some excellent scholars who are, as a professor at the University of the West Indies said to me one day, and she was right. You cannot go in any part of the world, in any university in the United States, in Great Britain, and not find a Jamaican professor, right? We are in every aspect, and we are in, every academic and whatever pursuits, right? So, but we need to understand that our country is not free. And I don't know at this late stage of the game, when we see, for example, the American empire collapsing before us, if we will ever be free, right? Because make no bones about it, the United States is the de facto colonial master of Jamaica, not Great Britain. The king is just a ceremonial head of state, a symbolic head of state. So if Andrew Holness, the government of Andrew Holness, wants to free us, we would have to be freed from that, colonial interchange between the Americans and ourselves. And that's not possible at this juncture of the game. I hope that you have, gleaned something from my discourse today, and I will be taking up this conversation in another video. So all the best to you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.